Welcome to Brevard News, your home for real news in Brevard County. Our special edition of Brevard News today is our Brevard News focus is on behind the scenes of human trafficking in the United States as well as all over the world. This is a real problem. We have a special guest today. Our guest is Kathryn Robbins, and she is a anti-human trafficking advocate, speaker, and trainer. Kathryn, welcome.
Hi.
You have a fascinating story, and not necessarily one that you'd want everybody to have, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. First of all, thank you for having me. I have been watching you for months since you started this podcast, and as you know, I am friends with Katie Delaney and just so thrilled to be on here. Thank you for having me. My story is that I was born and raised in a family that had been generationally trafficking children around the United States, and by the time we got to my generation, it was abroad. So I was trafficked from the time I was born in diapers around the U.S. and abroad.
So when you say that you were trafficked by people that were generational traffickers, what does that mean?
Well, as far back as I know, which would have been my grandparents' generation, they were trafficking victims, including family members, in the 40s in the U.S.
So when you say traffic, just give us a definition of what that means.
That's a great question. That is a great question, and I've been told I should qualify or quantify, whatever word you use, that when I speak. So when I say human trafficking, the U.S. definition of human trafficking is either sexual trafficking or sexual exploitation, or it's labor trafficking. And for the purposes of this podcast, we'll be talking about sexual exploitation, sexual trafficking. So I was trafficked from the time I was born in exchange for money, power, favors, whatever they exchange it for, around the world.
So this is kind of mind-boggling for people to believe that even a kid in diapers.
Yes. And so, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
The way human trafficking of children in particular works is that the younger the child, the higher the price tag when they're trafficked.
Why?
Perversion. People who want an infant in diapers who still can't even speak are generally more perverse and possibly more desperate. It's all wickedness and induced by the enemy. So they will pay more money to get access to an infant. There are less of them, probably, and than there are 16-year-olds or 18-year-olds or 25-year-olds.
What kind of person does this? I mean, obviously, the view of an evil person is relative depending on how a lot of people see it, right? Some people think conservatives are evil, but a person like this, are they just a street person? Are they corporate? What kind of a person does this?
In the case of my trafficking growing up, there was not an arena or a people group that was excluded from either selling me or purchasing me. It included business people. It included the public school system. It included public school administrators. It included the military. It included law enforcement at the local and federal level. It included pastors and churches.
You experienced all of this.
Yes.
So what was your thinking growing up? When did you come to an understanding that something's wrong here?
I knew early on, very early on, that what they were doing was wrong. And the downside of that for me as a child was because I kept my mental faculties and they weren't able to split my personality, which is very common in early child abuse. Because of that, I fought them. So I would at 5, 6, 7, 8, even 10 years old think what you're doing is wrong. And
them, you're talking about your
them,
parents.
the traffickers.
The traffickers.
The traffickers.
Okay.
And let me step back 1 second. I ended up not being raised by my mother and father. I ended up being raised by extended family members. So
To whom you were sold.
to whom I was given to, basically. because that's the way it works. Children stay in these families, and if you can't take care of your child for whatever reason, you're going to give that child to the other person who's trafficking them. So it was not my parents, and both of my parents are dead now. But what was the question you asked me right before that?
So we were talking about what kind of person is involved in this, and so you said that there's not really any definition. I mean, it's across all kinds of racial,
Oh gosh.
economic lines.
Yes, because of my age, this happened, almost 6 decades ago. Uh, Back then, I did not witness, nor did I experience as many African Americans, Hispanics. So there were not as many varied races involved in the trafficking
Why is that?
or in purchasing me and other children. I'm not sure why. I wish I could answer that, but right now it's much more broad and varied than it used to be.
So that's interesting. At a time when there purportedly was a lot of racial problems, you did not see that kind of diversity with regard to human trafficking.
No.
And when did it
Not
change?
child trafficking. Perhaps it was different in adult trafficking, but I was able to escape before I became an adult. So I didn't see it that way. I didn't experience it that way. And I was trafficked in other countries. So I'm specifically talking about the United States. I also didn't live in an area that had a lot of ethnicities living near us.
So do you think that that was the answer to it?
Say that a
Do
different
you
way.
It's because of the fact that you weren't around a various amount of ethnicities
I'm
that
not
you
sure.
didn't see more?
I'm not sure. I think culturally that there was a time in my lifetime when it would have been way more taboo in an African American family or a Hispanic family than it was in a white family. And this is just supposition based on my experience. It doesn't mean I can back that up with any kind of fact.
Right.
That's just
So
my thoughts on it.
totally antidote.
Yeah.
So what was a day like in your life as you were growing up in this kind of a situation?
That's a good question. I went to school. So I would be, we didn't have a term for it even just a few years ago. So I would be what was considered and what is now considered a familial trafficking victim. And a familial trafficking victim is a victim who is being trafficked by the custodial guardians that they live with out of the family home. So it's not a runaway. It's not someone who is an adult and prostituting themselves. It's actually being done out of the family home. So as a familial trafficking victim, that means I got up, I went to school. I came home from school. Sometimes I had a little time where there was a little bit of peace, but by evening time, as soon as it started to get dark, on most evenings, I don't know if it was all of them, but most evenings, on weekends, on summers, I was removed from the home and taken to a third location, a remote location somewhere. It could have been a public school. It could have been a church. It could have been an outdoor place. It could have been a cellar underground, underneath someone's property. Just any kind of, it could have been a public official building, could have been a judge's chambers. So I would have been taken, and most of the time when I was taken out to be trafficked, I was taken with other children. So it would be gang trafficking, group trafficking. We would be gang raped by multiple buyers. So it typically wasn't a one-on-one situation.
So what age do you recollect that these kind of experiences?
My recollections probably start 6. They become very distinct and clearer at the age of about 7.
So what are you thinking when this is happening? From the time that you leave, do you know where you're going? And what are you thinking when you get there?
I was thinking that I was trapped and this was my life. I wanted to die. So I spent most of the time when I was younger pleading with some higher being that I didn't know at the time to kill me, because I would witness other children lose their lives inside of this criminal enterprise. And that looked like what I now know as mercy. So when I would see another child die, I would beg to be killed. Beg to
You
be
saw
killed.
them die how?
The average lifespan of a victim of trafficking from the date of the onset of trafficking is 7 years. So when your body is being brutalized over and over and over, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds of times a week, the likelihood that you live through that for very long is slim. So a lot of times they died because they took a hit to the head, they took some sort of beating and the body just couldn't take any more. They were starved to death. We had our own doctors and lawyers on staff, and so often we were drugged, and sometimes they didn't get the drugs right, and a child would die, and sometimes they just eliminated them because it was a full moon and it was time to eliminate a child.
So what was your interaction with the people that were engaged in this? I mean, what did you observe about them? Were they sympathetic? Were they humanless? Did they not care at all? What
I
did you observe?
I just thought they were all evil. Back when I was a child, adults were to be feared and the children were victims.
Did you see any empathy at all from any of these people that were engaging in these things?
Not that I recall. It may have been there. The empathy that I saw, actually, it became more clear to me that that's what I was witnessing when I got into my teenage years. And it became obvious to people in school, so staff, faculty, inside of my schools, that something was not completely right in my family. The area that we lived in was considered sort of infamous for child abuse, crimes. There were rumors that we had a mob. So it was not unusual for people to know that there were dark forces controlling some things on the periphery and that people were being hurt. We had interesting murder cases happen around us. And so I think a lot of people suspected that my family was involved with a lot of this, and they may have tried to intervene or to get me help and were met with consequences or resistance. And so what ended up happening as I got into my teenage years is I started to notice that there would be certain teachers or faculty in my schools that took a particular liking to me suddenly, and they would just be really kind, and they would look me in the eye when I showed up at school and ask me how I was doing. They'd put their arms around me in an appropriate way. And I noticed that that wasn't done with a lot of the other students. And so it became clear to me, at least I received it as a message of them saying, I see you and I know something's going on and I just want you to know. And sometimes they would tell me, I just want you to know I'm here if you need anything.
Did you ever say anything to anybody about what was going on?
I tried telling a second grade teacher, and I was expelled from school and called a liar and basically abused by her for the rest of the school year. So it's likely that she or some part of her family were part of it, or she was terrified of it.
So do you think that in many of these instances people are scared of actually saying things because of the rejection, the refusal to believe it?
I think in the case of what was happening with this group of people in this area that I grew up in, that if anyone knew of it or heard of it, I think they knew better than to open their mouth. I would liken it to people now who know better than to be whistleblowers because they might get suicided. I think there were people who really did know what was going on, and they knew that they couldn't intervene and they couldn't get to a corrupt police force that was part of my trafficking and see anything done. So their best alternative was to love me right where I was and let me know that they cared about me and build enough relationship with me. This is one of the things I preach now when I speak. be a normal person in your normal environments and love minors and people enough to build a relationship with them so that if something is happening, give them 6 months, give them a year of just loving on them and building trust. And then when they're ready and it feels safe to them, they'll tell you what's going on, then you can intervene. But a lot of times we have to sow the seeds of trust first. And I started to see that when I got into my teenage years. So, and one of the things that did for me was it created a keen awareness of the difference between this environment that I was living in and being abused in and these other people.
So what was the difference between your younger years and your teenage years with regard to the trafficking?
Because I think that for me, as a child in school, I don't know if people noticed it as much or if I just was so sick when I got to school and so exhausted and so beaten up that I just didn't even have the energy to recognize it. Or maybe it's just that my memories are a little bit foggier about that stuff when I
So
was younger.
when you're going through this, I mean, does your mind just go numb and it's just routine? What take me through that? Now you don't have to get graphic, but I'm just
Well,
curious.
uh, so what's really common in victims of child abuse, especially before the age of 5, is some form of dissociation. And there's a big spectrum of dissociation. It can go from 95 and not remembering the last 5 minutes of our drive. That's a form of dissociation, all the way to blown multiple personality. The goal for most child abusers is actually full-blown multiple personalities so that they can handle that child. Their brain and their personality is not wholly functioning and they're easier to control. That didn't happen in my case. However, they were using IV drugs and extensively with me. And there are certain drugs that I believe they used and that can erase your memory partly. So what would happen is I would know what was going on all long, all into 5 a.m. when I was being returned to my house. And by the time I went to sleep, they had drugged enough that when I woke up in the morning, I didn't remember. So I knew I was being beaten inside my home. I knew I was exhausted. I knew I could barely function. I was very thin and starving to death, but I didn't always, every day when I went to school, I didn't always remember. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. And so I think for the most part, I was just going through, I wouldn't say I was numb. I felt everything, but I was just going through the motions of trying to survive. I mean,
So,
I wanted to die and at the same time was just trying to survive getting through a day of school and knowing that I was going to get off a school bus and what was going to meet me that evening was something nefarious.
so how did you do in school?
Hmm?
How did you do in school?
I was a straight A student.
So did you just kind of redirect your attention towards
It
school?
was my life. I love the only place where I was ever really affirmed in my world was for my excellent grades in school.
So I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, 18,000 people. I remember as a kid, we were allowed to go anywhere. And we were pretty much carefree. Nobody bothered us or anything. We heard about the boogeyman. Don't get in a car with somebody who offers you candy, right?
Right.
So that's the ideal of a lot of people concerning maybe human traffickers. So tell me how different that is from the
Oh, it's so
reality.
different. Depending on where you get the statistic or how it's compiled, right now in the United States, 25 to 47%. So up to half, depending on where the stat comes from. And this is why I don't use a lot of statistics because they vary and I don't think they're always reliable. They're great for fundraising. They're not always super accurate, but 25 to 47% of children being trafficked in the United States are familial victims. They are being trafficked by a parent, a guardian, a foster parent, grandparent out of their family home. So this idea that they're being kidnapped and that it's all runaways or it's happening in third world countries is absolutely a farce.
So is there a bad thing in that they've created an atmosphere in many of your societies where people are petrified of allowing their kids to even go down to the local grocery store, which we never had that. My parents really never gave any thought to that. We were allowed to come and go whenever, and we had obviously a curfew. But I mean, is there a detriment to that in that they've actually caused fear where there's not really warranted to have fear when some of the real um, boogeymen are not really people just wandering the streets?
I think it's
Yes,
both. And so
it's
I
both.
think it's warranted. Yes. One of my passions is to train parents to tweak the way they parent their children in order to make their children grow up less prone to being victimized by a predator. So I call it victim resistance.
Okay.
And you, there has to be this idea of stranger danger is wrong. Uh, and yet you do have to plan for it. So you can't, we can no longer to afford to raise our children the way you and I were raised in the 70s. We can't afford to do that because there are risks everywhere. However,
So the risks are real, no
the
matter
risk,
where you're living.
the risks are real. However, we can't just see the risk as going alone 2 blocks down to the grocery store. Is that a risk? Yes. But then that same person will think sending their kid to church Sunday school is not a risk. And it is. Or that them being down at the softball field, watching their friend play softball is not a risk. Yes, it is.
So tell me some of the characteristics that you can point out that people can know that their kid might be in danger. You might want to keep your eyes open. Are there some characteristics that you
Okay,
look
do
for?
you want to know the environmental characteristics, or do you want to know what to look for in a child that you think may be being endangered already?
Both.
Okay, so environmental characteristics, I would say they should never be without eyesight of a trusted adult. I don't care if they're 16. I don't. I don't. And I think that there's a way to do that that is not fear-based. I think that if we would step back and understand that when we are given children, we are given them to steward. So if we look at that like we are mentoring them, let's liken it to mentoring. Then our job is to mentor them, not to instill fear in them and have them live in
Would you
fear.
say that a lot of kids live in fear today because of this?
I don't think enough of them do, to be honest. And
Have fear, no fear.
yeah, and I think it's
Yeah.
the same for parents. I see a lot of people think, oh, well, I've known my neighbors for 10 years, so I totally trust my kids being there. That's fine, but you don't know when another neighbor is going to pop in, drop by, come by to pick something up, or somebody from Facebook Marketplace shows up to pick up a table, or Uncle John shows up out of the blue or is invited because there's a birthday party. You don't know them. And so when I was raising my daughter, I never allowed her to be in another environment that I was not in. And that included a daylight birthday party.
So you said environmental, and then you said from the child's point of
What to
view. What
look at
about the
for the,
environmental?
okay, so if you're to look at children at risk and wonder if they're being trafficked, if you're out publicly and you see something, you're not going to be able to intervene. But the things that you're looking for when people are out in public is if there's somebody nearby watching them, and if that person does not look like a parent, they just look like somebody else or somebody nefarious or questionable, that's an issue. Oftentimes you will see them without any technology. So that's an immediate red flag if you see a young person under the age of 18, let's say between 10 and 18, and they don't have technology. I tell people that if I suspected something like that and I knew I could get to the child, say in a public mall, I would walk up to the child and say, oh my gosh, my car just broke down and my phone is not working. Can I please use your phone? And I would be looking for them to verify whether or not they have technology on them. And I'd be watching to see who they're looking for in the space that we're in. And so there are markers. There are things that you can look for.
What about the from the kid's point of view? What are you seeing with the kid?
Say that, ask it a different way.
From the kid's point of view, what are the markers for a kid who is actually being involved, who is involved in this? What can a person see, a parent see, or someone see that
In
is
their
going
own
on
child,
in the
the
kid?
child
Yes.
see typically withdrawals, see sexualized behavior. You'll see them hiding and very secretive. You'll see them, sometimes they could be sneaking out of the house at night. The challenge is, and we don't have a lot of time to talk about all this, but one of the challenges right now is that a child can be trafficked in the family home in their own bedroom with the parents downstairs and they do not even know it. And the way that happens is through technology. So these sextortionists, these people get attached to our children through social media, and then they will ask them to send a picture of them in a pair of shorts. Then that leads to something that's nude. Then they own them. And then a child can be in their own bedroom doing sexual things on camera, and it is being sold.
So is technology in the hands of a kid wrong? Would you allow your kids to have technology, or how would you handle that?
I would not. And my best recommendation is that there is a pastor, I think he's out of Michigan or Wisconsin, named Jonathan Brozozog. So he's got a very interesting last name. And he has written a book and teaches around the country something called, I think it's called phone permit or technology permit. You can find him, Brozozog. And what he teaches is that we should train up our children to use technology the same way the state and we train them as in a permit for their children, for them to have a driver's license. So there's 1 year where they can't do certain things behind the wheel of a car. They can't have certain people in that car. They have to be observed. Someone has to be with them for 1 solid year during their permit training, right? And so he says that we need to be training on technology with our kids the same way. I agree with him. There should not be any technology that is not within an adult's view inside the home, period.
Brevard County, what's happening in Brevard County? Is there human trafficking in Brevard County
Of
that you
course
know of?
there is. Yeah,
So,
anybody who tells you there's no human trafficking in anywhere in your county or the state of Florida, you can go to the FBI website right now, and on the FBI website, they tell you that they believe a pedophile lives within every square mile of the U.S. So to say that there's none of that happening in any place is ridiculous at this point.
we have the right circumstances in place where it probably would perpetuate that more, like with the port and so forth.
Always, anytime that you're close to airports, close to big event centers, close to ports, and I know this is one of the larger ports in the world, if I understand things correctly, at least in the U.S., we're an island, so there's a lot of exit and entry points through transportation here in the state of Florida, so all of it is at risk. I know they say that it's Orlando, Tampa, and Miami are the 3 biggest hubs in the state of Florida, and as much as, again, people like statistics and they help us to raise funds for police and all that kind of stuff, we need them. Those numbers, I think, change very quickly. Anytime there's a city, a lot of population moving around, people can hide, there's going to be human trafficking.
So tell us, as you get ready to wrap up, what would you want parents to know more than anything about human trafficking and your experiences in it?
That your child is at risk, whether you like it or not, and that every place where adults are, that children gather, there is probably someone who is a pedophile or a trafficker watching them. That includes shopping malls. They should not be out in these places completely unwatched by trusting eyes. You've got to take more precautions. And the other thing is that the one thing I think that we need to do is train our children to trust their own intuition. So whether you call it discernment, God-given intuition, whatever you want to call it, that little voice inside their stomach that goes off when they don't like something, if we can really affirm that in them and teach them to trust that voice, even when it doesn't make sense to us, then they will grow up trusting that own inner alarm, and they will know when something's not right and they'll walk away from it. But if we keep as a culture or as a family gaslighting people so that they don't trust their own intuition, we are going to continually become a larger victim society.
Now, this is a huge topic, and we didn't even scratch the surface of it, but people can contact you on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X, and your address is a restored grace,
A restored
correct?
grace, yes.
So they can write you there and get more information? Kathryn, thanks for joining us. This is just an amazing story, and thank God that you were able to get out of it. And thank you for visiting with us today. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for joining another edition of Brevard News. This is Brevard News Focus. You have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.